Hi students, this is really sad, but obviously I am providing you with lectures while I am not currently with you all. So typically we'd start our day off with a Mentimeter, but that's not happening, so I apologize. Now this is meant to be kind of more like a guided lecture, so you should be reading all of this in your textbook. So chapter 9 is what we're going to go over. We're starting with opioids, and then I'll give you helpful lectures for each of the subsequent chapters. Okay, so definitely keep reading or else you probably won't have all the details that you need. But looking at the introduction, you'll see that the person talking had a surgery and they were prescribed 90 pills, but the insurance company would not allow that much. So even the insurance company was recognizing that was an extremely high amount of medication, especially opioid medication, and they only prescribed 42, so just a little bit or less than half. And the person who was narrating this part discussed the responsibility of seeking to give the drugs back that they hadn't used. So the DEA, just so you know, always has a drug buyback day, but I think other local agencies will do so as well. And so if you look at the picture there that I posted, you'll see that CVS has a medication disposal you can safely take the drugs back to if you don't want to keep them, for obvious reasons, in your house where people can access them. And then, just so you know, opioids have a long history of being utilized, more so though as morphine and opium. So for 200 years, you should know that morphine was the primary ingredient derived from opium, and it has been used, it's still used medicinally for pain-killing purposes, right? So if you move on to the next stage where it talks about opioids, basically opioid just means opium-like. So it can be any kind of medication or substance that has some similar features. However, it does not have to be structurally similar. They just have to operate in a similar mechanism, so produce the same effects on the patients or the individuals using them. The next slide gives you 4 different categories of opioids, which I would encourage you to read through and know. But moving on, opioids have been referred to as narcotics, and actually a lot of drugs have, but narcotic is Latin for stupor, so stupor-inducing. Think about perhaps how alcohol makes people feel, right? And that is kind of what we see with a stupor. Now, people use the word narcotic for a lot of other drugs, even though it's not really applicable to the true meaning of the Latin word. For example, we have amphetamines, we have cocaine. These are all uppers. These would not produce a stupor, yet people refer to most psychoactive drugs as narcotics, and that, of course, would not be actually correct. So look at the world history of opioids. It has been used for over 3,000 years. People have been harvesting raw opium from poppies, and this is mostly in locations that have very hot climates, and they can recruit, unfortunately, really low-income workers to do the harvesting of the poppy seeds for them. And so I have some pictures there of the flower itself, and they can grow to be 3 to 4 feet high, the plant itself rather. And when the petals have fallen but the seed capsule still remains and is not ripe, they're going to go through and they're going to cut into that capsule area. When it first happens, it's going to produce this milky white substance, but once they let it cool overnight and they come back, it's going to be a reddish brown, almost like a thick syrup, and that is what they're going to use to transition into heroin and other drugs. So just so you know, oh my gosh, opium has been used for a long time, and there's a drink called laudanum. It was combined, or used rather, by combining opium, wine, and spices. So mixing alcohol and opium and then just adding some flavors. And it was called this because it was considered something to be praised. So people were enjoying the effects of this drink. As you can imagine, it was quite popular for 200 years. However, we do see that there is a war over opium, which I actually did not know prior to this course. So the 2 countries involved are going to be Britain and China, and it starts off innocently enough. So As you know, each country has their own commodities, and China had been smoking opium for quite some time, or a lot of the people in China, rather. More so, they had been using it orally as a medicine. And when the British came to visit China, they fell in love with silk and the tea. So they wanted to try and exchange something for that. They knew that they were using opium in China. Now, Chinese medical professionals were using it for a number of things, mostly, as you can imagine, as a painkiller, but it was also used to treat intense cases of diarrhea. And so it had been used for quite a long time, but the British come in and they have a company that they create called the East India Company to kind of keep themselves distanced from this, but they're going to infiltrate the country, bring in a lot of opium, and exchange it for, again, tea and silk. This is problematic because they're also introducing the pathway for other individuals in China to become addicted to opium and creating a social problem for them there. So they started to recognize this, and there was a commissioner with China who confiscated a huge shipment of opium and then burned it publicly in the town square, which then started the Opium War officially. So this continues for quite some time. We do see that Britain, as you can imagine, was a little extreme in their response. So they were forcing China to sign over Hong Kong in their first treaty, and this only lasts until 1997. Hong Kong is part of China. They also required that China paid them over $600 million, or what would be equivalent to $600 million today. And they wanted them to permit them to have, for the English or British, to have exclusive trading rights in China. They have a second treaty 18 years later, and they're forced to legalize opium throughout their borders. They also are forced to watch as British soldiers burn down the summer palace of the emperor, which you can see there. The remains are still standing. And then this was a really humiliating time for China. So historians often refer to 1842 as the first year of a century of humiliation for the Chinese. So let's move into Britain now that we've talked about a long-standing history of opium use in China. In Britain, they preferred to drink laudanum, while the Chinese started to prefer smoking opium. And in Britain and even in the US, we started to see that moms and also dads, as well as physicians and companies, were promoting the use of opium among children, infants, and toddlers. And mostly this was going to be due to teething pain. So they would advocate for this as a pain supplement to help, or pain killer rather, to help the child feel better. But they would also use it if the baby was experiencing colic, or if they wanted to keep the children quiet. So it has been used for quite some time, and it was used among children in the US. In the US, there was an interesting phenomenon where women used opium more than men, but men were more likely to use alcohol. And so they would go out and drink, and people started promoting opium as a cure for alcoholism. It seems counterintuitive, but at the time they believed that at least the wives would be happy because their husbands would not be out drinking. They'd probably fall asleep from the effects of opium. Ironically, they claim that the cure for opium was alcohol. So we can see that there were some fallacies there. We do see in the 1800s that there is an influx of Chinese railroad workers who really did essentially build the railroads in the United States, their bare hands, and they started to smoke opium. Now, this is not new for them, right? They've already been doing this, but they bring opium dens into the U.S., in quotes, and these are locations where you could go and smoke opium. But a lot of American sentiment suggested that it was associated with immoral behavior, and they discouraged going to these dens. In fact, in 1875, San Francisco was the first city to ban opium smoking, and then federal law followed suit. This was not because it was significantly different from what was happening already in the US. It was racially targeting those Chinese workers who had come over and who people were associating with immoral behaviors. So let's move into morphine and how it changes into, or how we see it introduce us to heroin. So you can see a lot of times throughout these chapters, you're going to see a lot of German doctors who were influencing the advent of different medicines, and this is the case again. Friedrich Wilhelm Adam Struner was the one who first created morphine, and he named the substance after Morpheus, which is the god of dreams. So imagine that connection as you can see why that would be the case. So they found out that it was 10% the total weight of opium, so it was a very, small weight, but it still was 10 times stronger, or approximately 10 times stronger than raw opium itself. And they also pulled codeine and thebaine from it, and codeine accounted for 0.5% of raw opium, where thebaine accounted for 0.2% of raw opium. And then again, we see Germany coming up again. So heroin was produced officially by the Bayer Company in Germany, and that's a medicinal company. Still exists today, as you're probably aware of. You've probably seen it. And it was used as a cough suppressant, so to help when you had a cough and to stop that the spasming and the cough. And then it also relieved chest pain associated with pneumonia and tuberculosis. And then if you had to guess which one's stronger, heroin or morphine, heroin is stronger than morphine. Okay, we look at opioids in American society, and I'm going to skip around a little bit, but it's really important to know that there are different eras of opioid use in the U.S., and we're still experiencing, as you know, a contemporary issue with opioid epidemic. So in 1900, it was estimated that because of our acceptance of opium, 1 out of every 10 Americans were dependent upon opioids. And then we have the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. It does not forbid the use of opium, but it does require that doctors who are prescribing the drug, that they require them to register with the IRS and pay a tax for doing so. However, the Supreme Court came back and made it illegal for any doctor to prescribe any opioid if it was not being used for medicinal purposes. So we see that this becomes a really big pull for the black market, and so a lot of people realize, okay, it's not that expensive to make. We can refine the raw opium overseas, and then to avoid being caught, they sent it over in after they refined it into heroin, they would put it in little baggies and ship it to the U.S. instead of doing big, bulky shipments, because that'd be obvious and easier to catch. And so the price skyrocketed because the supply and demand was affected. And then with heroin abuse, we see multiple areas of importance, but the one I want you to focus on is the Vietnam War. So 1 in 10 Vietnam vets returned home dependent on heroin, and they started to ensure that they would have to be drug tested through a urine test, and they called this Operation Golden Flow. Interestingly, though, the following year, they wanted to see how many individuals were still dependent on opium and opioids. Heroin, and only 1 to 2% of them were. So that suggests that actually a lot of them did not maintain that addiction. It's good to know, though, that the pricing of a 250 milligram dose of heroin at the time in the U.S. would cost $500, and in Vietnam it would only cost them $10. Add in the fact that the purity level of heroin was 90 to 98% pure in Vietnam, but it was only 2 to 10% pure in the U.S. So they're getting stronger drugs for a cheaper price. You probably already know about black tar coming from Mexico. We've talked about that. We watched a video, and we also saw some pictures. If you recall, it did not look very appetizing. So now let's move into more contemporary issues. We have the overprescription of opioid medications. If any of you have watched Painkiller on Netflix, It really exemplifies this issue, but if you haven't watched it yet, I would highly recommend doing so. And so we see that there were 6 times more opioids dispensed per residence in 2015 in the highest prescribing counties. So we could have assumed maybe it was locationally or geographically affected. However, they looked at differences in prescription rates by rural versus urban locations, income level, and demographics, and only 1/3 of the prescriptions could be attributed to those factors. So the CDC is going to come out in 2016 and create guidelines for prescribing these medications. In 2017, the American College of Physicians basically mandates that for back pain, which is a common complaint with individuals who receive these medications, that they should only use or prescribe these drugs as a very last resort to a number of other treatment modalities and medications. We're going to see that this is going to progress and get more and more dangerous. As you are aware, we've talked about this. So when I first asked you all what the most dangerous drug in American society is right now, hands down the vast majority of you said fentanyl. And so we're going to see that fentanyl has been used, and it still is used today in a medical setting, but it did get repurposed, and people started to use it on the streets. It has been used since the 1960s, and just so you know, a dose of 2 milligrams would be fatal to a human being. We see that it's now smuggled in by China or Mexico, and 1 out of every 7 confiscations of fentanyl contaminated heroin came from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Augusta, Maine, and this was in 2015. So as you know, illicit fentanyl is mixed with other drugs, which then increases overdose rates and fatalities. And for carfentanil, which is even stronger, I believe on slide 14 you guys can see the dosage there for a fatal amount of each of the drugs of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil for humans. But elephants, they can be killed or even sedated, but oftentimes killed from only 10 milligrams of carfentanil, and the average elephant weighs about 15,000 pounds. So you can see how dangerous carfentanil is for humans. Now we're starting to see the effects of the opioid crisis, and it's kind of overshadowing the effects of other drugs that are harmful. And so in 2017, they estimated that approximately 134 people died per day as a result of opioid-related overdose deaths. In Montgomery County alone, there were 281 overdose deaths from January to February, 1 month in 2017. And the toxicology reports identified fentanyl, or fentanyl analog, in 92% of the cases, but pure heroin was only found in 6%. So we've been increasing the cost of fighting this epidemic for quite some time. From just 2000 to 2017, we see a 600% increase in the amount of funding. I'm also going to attach a video, so I'm just going to very briefly skim over this, but there is an emphasis on opioid crisis intervention courts, much like the drug courts we've already covered. When you look at opioid effects on the mind and body, there's a few factors there to look over. I want you to look over the differences in the routes of administration or consumption too. Specifically pay attention to injection. And then for patterns of heroin abuse, mainlining is the most common route of administration. And other locations across the world, their cultures even utilize heroin, they just do so differently. So in the Middle East and Asia, it's more common to smoke it. It's not very effective if you administer heroin orally, at least compared to mainlining or shooting it. And people often fear the really severe consequences of withdrawing from heroin. So the first sign, which you would experience within 4 to 6 hours of ceasing to use heroin, is going to be craving, a very intense, strong urge to continue using. But most people, on average, if they've been using for quite some time, they will get over that withdrawal period and those adverse symptoms within 5 to 10 days. We know that heroin is lethal, but when looking at the long-term effects of heroin use on the body, studies thus far have not identified any damage to organs or tissues, but smoking and inhaling those vapors can lead to a disease, and you can see it there, right? It's going to be really lethal as well. There are some medical assistance programs for opioid abuse. So I'm not an expert in both of these. When I was working as a crisis intervention specialist, I did have the privilege of working across from a drug center, rehabilitation center rather, and they often prescribe Suboxone or naloxone, which is a form of buprenorphine. And then there's also Vivitrol, which is in a monthly injection. So that's kind of a benefit. You can go that route instead of having to go and take a pill every day. The problem is for most people who have an addiction to opioid is that they have to have completed complete detoxification from the drug first and foremost. And most counties do not have treatment options. So that is a very unfortunate fact. Now to detox, I mentioned some of those symptoms are very severe. So going cold turkey is really challenging for a lot of people, and one reason why people do not successfully recover. So there are some drugs that can help kind of stabilize individuals until that detoxification period has ended. There's also methadone maintenance, so it kind of keeps that level in the body without the person needing to go turn to other forms of opioid medications or heroin or fentanyl, etc. It does reduce the risk of contracting HIV and AIDS because you're not injecting needles. It can reduce some crime. It's been linked to that. And it does require daily treatment. Okay. There's also therapeutic communities, which we've talked about. There's multi-modality programs, which means you have to address the person at large and not just their addiction. And then I think we've mentioned Narcotics Anonymous before, and 12-step programming, those can help. Please also look over medical uses of opioid drugs because you should know that. And then OxyContin abuse in particular. Again, Painkiller on Netflix is a fantastic, it's not fictional, but it's basically got some embellishments in it, but it does give a true account of what happened. And then you can see there's a woman there who's sadly holding a picture of her deceased son who did not win his battle with opioid addictions. So there's some help for that, but also please look over the chapter, read it, and I'll post some additional videos to help you out. Okay, bye guys.